As her legal husband, I managed to force the powerful Vance family to throw their own heir, Olivia, into prison. I made sure the car accident that left 3 dead was pinned entirely on her, nearly sending her to death row. Now, after her sentence was commuted to 13 years, I sit across from her behind the glass as the visiting spouse, smiling as I tell her that if she dies inside, her entire inheritance might just end up in my pockets. It is all because she once told me that since I grew up in the gutters, a few years in a cell shouldn't matter to me. But in my mind, the script has flipped. She is the one who will crawl in the dirt forever while I have finally climbed out of hell. My fiancée, Olivia, actually wanted me to take the fall for Jerry. That scumbag killed a pedestrian while driving drunk and then fled the scene, yet she had the audacity to suggest I should be the one to serve his time. This was not some trashy soap opera, so I snapped at her right then and there. She did not even flinch, telling me it was only a few years, and that since I was trash from the streets anyway, that kind of life would be nothing to me, whereas Jerry's bright future could not be tarnished by a criminal record. I refused to budge, which prompted her to snap her fingers, signaling 3 bodyguards to step forward like a wall of stone. Across the dining table, my parents stared intently at their plates without saying a word, and that silence was the clearest form of consent I had ever seen. In less than a minute, I was beaten down to the floor, coughing up blood onto their perfectly polished hardwood. I glanced at the bruised knuckles of the guards before my eyes finally met Olivia's cold, lifeless gaze. I forced a jagged smile and told them they were quite rough, coughing as I joked that they almost won. Jerry, who had been cowering behind Olivia the whole time, finally stepped forward with a pathetic, fake smile of sympathy, telling me he would always remember my sacrifice and that I was a true friend. I motioned for him to lean in closer, and as he bent down, I didn't hesitate. The next second, I drove a steak knife straight into his eye socket. He clutched his face as his horrific screams echoed through the massive dining room, eventually collapsing and twitching in agony on the floor. I threw my head back and laughed like a madman, my wild eyes locking onto my stunned parents and my completely speechless fiancée. I am not beneath any of you, I thought to myself in that moment. During my time in prison, I met an old man everyone simply called Pops. He handed me a tattered, falling apart paperback book while flashing a row of yellowing teeth. He told me that I had a unique build and asked if I wanted to learn a real craft. I looked down at the cover and saw the bold title, The Frostfire Manual. 2 years later, I was granted early parole for good behavior, and the warden's office had already notified my relatives. Olivia was waiting for me outside the prison gates, dressed in a flowing white gown with her hair pinned up, looking every bit like an elegant and untouchable swan. In contrast, I was standing there in my prison-issued sweats, looking like the ugly duckling they had tried so hard to drown. She looked me up and down with her usual cold and distant eyes. She told me that once we got home, I was to apologize to Jerry, and only then would she officially announce our engagement. While I was locked up, I had kept a close eye on the news and knew that the Sterling and Vance families were planning a massive merger involving several joint ventures. Announcing a marriage between the 2 houses was a calculated move to skyrocket their stock prices. Even with the money, no sane man would actually want to bring this woman home. I smoothed the wrinkles in my shirt and offered her a sharp, biting smile. I asked her how her pristine reputation would survive marrying a man with a criminal record like mine. She replied that the merger was already set in stone and that there was no room for negotiation, claiming she had no choice in the matter. She tried to look resigned, but it felt staged, as if she wasn't actually opposed to the arrangement at all. For a split second, I wondered if she actually had feelings for me, but I quickly shook that ridiculous thought out of my head. She most likely just realized that I, the biological son, was a more useful tool than the adopted Jerry. After all, Jerry isn't a true Sterling by blood, so there was never a guarantee the family empire would ever be his. Besides, there was no way a woman like Olivia would ever settle for a one-eyed freak. I am actually the biological son of the Sterling family who had been missing for years until they found me 3 years ago. Back then, I foolishly thought I was finally getting a real family and a shot at a happy life. Instead, I found that Jerry had already occupied my place so thoroughly that 20 years of shared memories easily outweighed the meager blood connection I had with them. I grew up in the industrial slums of Riverton, smelling of grease and grit, which made me a complete outsider to their sterilized, high-society lifestyle. My father, Robert, viewed my existence as a source of shame that needed to be strictly controlled and disciplined. My mother, Eleanor, always talked about loving both of her sons equally, but she showered Jerry with all the affection while finding every possible way to humiliate me. My sister, Megan, was only ever interested in the family business and barely acknowledged my presence. Then there was Olivia, who had grown up alongside Jerry as childhood sweethearts, looking like soulmates to everyone who saw them. When I first met her, I was completely infatuated and tried everything to win her over. However, in Olivia's eyes, her supposed fiancé was nothing more than a piece of trash she found utterly repulsive. The moment they asked me to go to prison for Jerry was like a bucket of ice water being dumped over my head, finally waking me up from my delusions. Looking at her now, I feel absolutely nothing but cold indifference. I told her flatly that I no longer had any ties to the Sterling family and that I had no intention of marrying her. My refusal sounded less like a statement and more like a command. She raised her hand, and those 3 bodyguards stepped forward once again. We had been through this routine many times before since they were her private security detail, and I had encountered them often back when I was foolishly pursuing her. I used to show up at her corporate headquarters constantly, only to have these 3 grab me and toss me out. It was always 3 against 1, and I used to lose by just a hair. This time, however, we were going to see who ended up on the floor. I struck first, slamming both palms into the chest of the nearest bodyguard. A dull thud echoed as a searing, white-hot pain exploded from his sternum and surged through his entire upper body. In the same motion, I delivered a low, sweeping kick to his shin. He froze instantly, his eyes bulging as if they were about to pop out of his head. A bone-chilling cold surged up from his lower half, causing fire and ice to collide violently within his body. The agonizing contrast was enough to drive anyone insane. A strangled cry escaped his throat as he gasped, asking what the hell was happening to him. I simply replied that it was the Frostfire manual. He collapsed to his knees with a heavy thud, froth beginning to bubble at the corners of his mouth. A few seconds later, the other 2 guards were lying right there next to him. Olivia stared at the scene with wide eyes, her face a mask of pure disbelief. Without sparing her another glance, I turned and walked away toward my destination, the Gilded Lily Spa, the most exclusive wellness club in Riverton. I was there to see Pops, the eccentric old man I had befriended in prison who had been released a few months before me. This club was his crown jewel. Pops gave me a toothy grin, his voice sounding like it had been sandpapered by a lifetime of cheap cigars. He told me it was good to see me out and warned that the real work was only just beginning. The word on the street was that Pops used to be a real legend in the underground boxing circuit, making a name for himself and racking up plenty of enemies along the way. As he got older, arrogant young fighters started showing up at his gym to challenge him. After a string of losses, his reputation took a hit and the gym went under. He eventually pivoted and opened this luxury spa, and to everyone's surprise, it became one of the most famous brands in all of Riverton. Despite his success, Pops was never truly happy because his heart was still set on reopening a real boxing gym. Over the years, he had combined his family's traditional fighting techniques with the principles of deep tissue massage to create something entirely new, which he called the Frostfire Manual. He claimed I was a natural-born prodigy and the toughest fighter he had ever encountered, being the only one to fully master his secret art. The very day I perfected the technique, an inmate a few cells down suddenly collapsed and started seizing. I alerted the guards immediately, saving the man's life and earning myself a commendation. From that point on, strange incidents seemed to follow me everywhere. Other inmates would suddenly lose their minds and start brawls with furniture, but I was always the one who ended up pinning them to the floor. Another guy tried to hang himself, but insisted I be there to witness his final moments. Naturally, I stepped in to save him and reported the incident, adding another notch to my record. In less than 6 months, I had saved nearly 100 people inside. The prison administration hailed me as a model inmate and put my parole on the fast track, though the other prisoners grumbled that I was a jinx who brought trouble wherever I went, secretly wishing I would just leave. The parole board's unanimous approval didn't surprise me since I knew Pops was pulling the strings from behind the scenes. His influence in that prison was greater than the warden's, as he enjoyed a private suite, personal massages, and even the ridiculous luxury of a smartphone. I didn't take his comments about me being a natural fighting genius too seriously, though. The man spent all day watching fantasy dramas and reading trashy sci-fi on his phone, speaking in such a theatrical way that I knew better than to believe his hype. One thing he said was undeniably true, and that is that I am now the most dangerous man in all of Riverton. I have reached a level where I am practically unbeatable because Pops himself was the one who taught me how to strike. He orchestrated my early release for one specific purpose. He wanted me to dominate the underground fighting circuit in the city. Once I made a name for myself, he planned to use that momentum to officially reopen his gym. To celebrate my return, Pops booked a private room at a top-tier steakhouse. After dinner, he even arranged for one of his elite therapists to give me a private massage. Her name was Chloe, and she had soft eyes, delicate features, and an incredible physique. Her technique was flawless, but beneath her practiced, professional smile, I caught a glimpse of something cold and fragile. A fire of vengeance flared up inside me, because this woman was one of the people on my list. Perhaps I had been staring too long, as Chloe began to study my face more closely. She mentioned that I looked familiar and asked if we had met somewhere before. It was clear she didn't recognize me, likely because she never considered me worth her notice back then. Years ago, it was her boyfriend who had nearly tortured me to death before going on to destroy the person I cared about most, leading to an irreversible tragedy. I forced those dark memories back down and changed the subject, asking her how she ended up in this line of work. Chloe gave a dry laugh and explained that she couldn't hack it in college and found factory work too exhausting. She quickly added that I shouldn't look down on her, noting that senior therapists can pull in over $10,000 a month. I nodded and asked why she didn't just find a man to take care of her. She let out a frustrated hunk, complaining that she already had a boyfriend, but he was a total loser who barely made any money and had a terrible temper. As she spoke, she pulled down the collar of her uniform to reveal a nasty, purplish bruise on her chest that was shaped exactly like a footprint. I asked if he hit her, and she clarified that he had actually kicked her. She went on to say that he turned into a violent maniac whenever he drank. The more tragic her story became, the more satisfaction I felt deep down. When I asked how long they had been together, she said it had been years, having met him in college, and that he was her first love. My heart skipped a beat as I confirmed it was indeed him, that absolute animal. Perhaps talking about her past had made her emotional, because Chloe slowly rested her head on my shoulder, her long hair carrying the faint scent of jasmine. She sighed, saying that if her boyfriend were even half the man I appear to be, her life wouldn't be so miserable. I asked her curiously exactly how much she thought she knew about me. She told me that since Pops had personally selected me, I had to be someone special. Chloe actually knew far more about Pop's history than I did. Apparently, before he went straight, he was a legendary enforcer in the local criminal underworld. When he finally decided to run a legitimate business, he refused to use his old connections for revenge even after his gym went bust. By his own code, he was a man of firm principles. For the past few years, Pops had been traveling the world looking for the right talent, even going so far as to deliberately get himself sent to prison just to find an apprentice. I was stunned and asked if he really got himself incarcerated just to scout me. Chloe nodded, telling me that Pops was a man driven by his dreams. For a moment, I was completely at a loss for words. Chloe's warm breath tickled my neck as she looked at me with incredibly seductive eyes, asking what kind of man I was. I told her I was exactly the kind of man she needed, pulling her by the waist and pressing her body against mine. Meanwhile, over at the Sterling estate, Robert was reportedly losing his mind with rage after hearing that I intended to sever all ties with the family. Robert fumed about me being an ungrateful brat with no sense of family loyalty. My mother, Eleanor, was even more vicious, asking how that animal could possibly resent them after what he did to Jerry and suggesting to Robert that they just let me rot on the streets. Robert looked at his wife and sighed, reminding her that I was still their biological son and that the family business required my presence. Eleanor argued that I could handle whatever responsibilities Jerry once had, pointing out that since Jerry was now blind in one eye, there was no way the Vance family would still agree to the marriage. Robert went silent as her resentment toward me deepened even further. Finally, Robert rubbed his temples and called for his daughter, Megan, telling her to go find me and bring me back for a welcome dinner while ordering me to stop this nonsense. This was the first time Megan had ever made an effort to see me, and with the Sterling family's vast resources, locating me at the spa was a simple task. My sister and I share a resemblance, but she is a master at keeping her face an unreadable mask. The only time a smile ever touched her lips was when she looked at Jerry. However, her true devotion has always been to the family empire above all else. She truly believes that everyone should be sacrificed for the sake of the company, and I wouldn't be surprised if she ends up throwing her entire life away for that business. During my 2 years away, I had hardened considerably and built up quite a bit of muscle. Megan seemed almost impressed by the change, remarking that I finally looked like a Sterling. She then coldly informed me that our father had arranged a welcome dinner and that Olivia would be in attendance. I let out a mocking laugh, asking if it wasn't a bit ridiculous to hold a welcome home party for a convicted felon. I told her I thought they were all such high society elites who looked down on people from my kind of background. I made it clear to Megan that I was done with them and that they were no longer my family, but she simply replied that she had never considered me family in the first place. I told her with utter exhaustion that even if she had been there the day they forced me to take the fall for Jerry, nothing would have changed. Her tone shifted slightly as she mentioned that the company had just acquired the land in the old industrial district. Hearing those words made my blood run cold. That was the place where I grew up and where my most cherished memories still resided. When I asked what they planned to do with the property, Megan avoided a direct answer, simply stating that there were no concrete development plans yet. The implication was crystal clear: the fate of that neighborhood depended entirely on my cooperation. After a long silence, I finally nodded and agreed to visit the estate. Stepping back in his Sterling manner felt like walking into a foreign country where I didn't belong. The lavish, gold leaf decor was just as I remembered, and it still made me feel utterly out of place. Around the long dining table, the family members stared at me as if I were some kind of intruder. Robert told me to take a seat, pointing toward the empty chair next to Olivia. Jerry's face was tense, and I noticed he had grown his hair out over the last 2 years, using long bangs to hide his missing eye. He looked weak and pathetic, which made me burst out laughing, clearly striking a nerve. Jerry snarled that a convicted felon like me didn't deserve to sit anywhere near Olivia. I nodded in agreement, but added that a one-eyed cripple wasn't exactly a catch either. With a loud clang, Jerry slammed his silver onto the table and screamed for the servants to throw me out. This time, Olivia remained silent, though her expression was colder than anyone else's. Megan shot me a warning glance before turning to soothe Jerry, while Robert let out a roar that practically shook the table, ordering Jerry to get a hold of himself. Jerry shrieked, asking why everyone was blaming him when I was the one who had stabbed him in the eye. I just shrugged with a look of mock innocence, suggesting that since I'd already served my time, he should learn to be a bit more forgiving. He told me exactly where I could put my forgiveness. I turned to my mother and pointed out that he was now using that kind of language right in front of her. Eleanor's brow furrowed and her eyes burned with rage. I knew she was about to blow up, so I beat her the punch by loudly reminding Jerry that he was only the adopted child. I raised my voice so the entire room could hear as I declared that once our parents kicked the bucket, the entire Sterling fortune would belong to me. I made it clear that my very first act as head of the family would be to throw him out onto the street. That declaration hit him right where it hurt. And Jerry's remaining, I turned bloodshot as he grabbed Eleanor's arm and began sobbing like a toddler. He wailed to her, asking if she was really going to stand by and let me bully him like this. Eleanor immediately pulled him into a protective embrace and glared at me like a cornered animal, calling me a monster and asking how I could be so cruel after already blinding him. Olivia stood up and pointed a finger directly at my face, shouting that even if we got married, Jerry would always be her brother and she would protect him. I just laughed and asked if she was really that blind, telling her that marrying me was actually the most sadistic thing she could do to him. I stared her down and told her that their precious adopted son was actually in love with her. I asked her to imagine how he would feel once she was in my bed and bearing my children. Megan jumped to her feet and screamed for me to stop, reminding me that we were supposed to be a family. I just wagged a finger at her and said that since they had never treated me like family, I was simply returning the favor. It seemed that my 2 years away had made them forget who I really was, because they were all staring at me as if I were a complete stranger. In truth, I had always been this way, though for a while I let a pretty face cloud my judgment. Megan's expression was dark while Olivia's eyes were a whirlpool of conflicting emotions, and Robert just sat there with his brow furrowed in deep thought. Eleanor, however, was still hysterical, screaming at me to get out and declaring that I was no longer her son and that Jerry was the only child she acknowledged. I decided I wouldn't be staying for the rest of the meal, so I grabbed a roasted chicken leg from the serving platter and stripped the meat from the bone right in front of them. I tossed the clean bone into the trash can with a flourish, treating the gesture as my final, crude farewell to that house. Everyone's faces shifted between shock and fury, but Jerry's features were completely twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. People called that dilapidated neighborhood on the edge of the city the Barrens. It was a wasteland of crumbling apartment buildings and abandoned warehouses that had once been bustling when the local factories were still in operation. After the industry moved away, the whole area turned into a ghost town almost overnight. On a small dirt hill behind the Barrens stood a weathered, cracked wooden cross that had been bleached gray by years of wind and sun. The woman buried beneath that cross had saved my life and was the only person in this world I truly cared to remember. Her name was Clara. For as long as I could remember, it had just been the two of us against the world. She was 3 years older than me and was also an abandoned child, with rumors suggesting her biological parents had dumped her because they wanted a son, and her foster parents had never bothered to show up. Clara survived by scavenging for bottles and scrap metal, somehow managing to raise both herself and me in those harsh conditions. Once she was old enough, she got a job as a courier, and her meager wages were just enough to keep me in school. I hated seeing how exhausted she was every single day, so I finally told her I wanted to drop out and get a job so things would be easier for her. Clara absolutely refused to hear it, insisting that I had to stay in school because without an education, I would never make real money. It didn't make sense to me at the time, since the $5,000 she earned monthly seemed like a fortune to me. She would always tell me stories about people who studied their way into high-paying jobs that made tens of thousands a month. She told me that if I truly wanted to help her, I would study hard and make it into a good university. I eventually agreed to her wishes and managed to get into a local college in Rivard, though it was a third-rate institution known mostly as a place where rich kids went to buy their degrees. I only chose it because I didn't want to be too far away from Clara. As it turned out, that decision was a massive mistake. Within a few days of arriving, I was targeted by a group of campus bullies who had found out about my background and started calling me an orphan to my face. Those words cut deep into old wounds, bringing back all the insecurities I tried to bury and making me too timid to even talk back when they harassed me. They kept pushing until they finally tried to rob me of my meager living allowance. That money was everything Clara had saved for me, and it was worth more than my life, so there was no way I was handing it over. I finally stood my ground, but the result was 7 or 8 of them swarming me and beating me senseless. A beer bottle shattered against my head, and shards of glass sliced into my scalp as blood began to pour down my face. making my vision blur as the world started to spin. Through my hazy, distorted vision, I saw a slender figure sprinting toward me. It was Clara, and she was swinging a heavy tire iron like a woman possessed as she drove those bastards away from me. Afterward, she marched straight into the administration office and demanded they take action against my attackers. She refused to back down even an inch, and even went as far as contacting the local news stations to try and get reporters involved. The school realized the situation was going to blow up, and, fearing the negative publicity, decided to just expel the students who had jumped me. From that day on, nobody on campus dared to lay a finger on me. Clara told me that we were all born equal and that I wasn't beneath anyone, swearing that she would never let anyone bully me again. When I first joined the Sterling family, I caught a fleeting glimpse of Clara in Olivia's expression, and that single moment was enough to make me lose my heart to her completely. Now, the Sterlings have acquired the very plot of land where Clara is buried. The mere thought of her grave being disturbed fills me with a desperate, burning anxiety. I had already picked out a new resting place for her in a quiet, dignified columbarium at a local church, but the spot costs $50,000. I didn't even have $1,000 to my name. After a few more days of wandering, Pops took me to an underground fight in the basement of an old warehouse. I looked at him with confusion and asked if I had misjudged him as having gone legitimate. He glared at me and explained that since he didn't have a promoter's license yet, I needed to take a few underground fights to build a reputation so sponsors would start calling. I just rolled my eyes and stepped into the ring. As soon as the bell rang, I dropped my opponent with a single punch. I tracked down Pops afterward to get my cut, but the old fox only handed me $500. I lost it immediately, demanding to know what happened to the $20,000 we had agreed upon and accusing him of ripping me off. He screamed back that he wasn't cheating anyone and reminded me that I still owed him a fortune for my training. He pulled out a calculator with a straight face and crunched some numbers before shoving in my face, telling me I should have just called a master from the start. According to him, my tuition for the Frostfire manual came out to exactly $19,500. I gave him a sarcastic thumbs up and told him fine, I'd accept his math. Clara was the only one who had actually raised me, and believing the Sterlings were my family was the single biggest mistake of my life. From that point on, I refused to be tied down by anyone. Back in prison, I had sworn that Clara was the only family I would ever acknowledge. If $500 was all I got today, so be it, because I knew my fist would bring in the real money soon enough. After the fights that night, I was walking through a dimly lit alley when 6 massive guys blocked my path. To my surprise, the people leading them were Olivia and Jerry. Jerry had a twisted, psychotic grin on his face as he told Olivia he wanted my legs completely shattered. Olivia just nodded, her expression as cold as ice, and told me she had promised Jerry she would break my leg so they could finally be even. She bit her lip and added that I shouldn't worry because even if I ended up in a wheelchair, she would still marry me and take care of me. As she spoke, Pops and his guys reacted faster than anyone expected. The two groups stood facing each other in the narrow alley. Jerry gave a dismissive snort, asking if those 4 young guys and 1 old man really thought they could save me. I suggested he take another look and count again. Jerry brushed his bangs out of his eyes and cursed loudly when he realized there were actually 8 people on our side. His confidence vanished instantly. Pops glanced over at me and asked how we were going to handle this, and I told him there was only one way to handle it before charging forward. I launched myself into the air and delivered a massive kick to the chest of a thug holding a steel pipe. The entire alley erupted into chaos as both sides clashed. The therapists from the club all had hands of iron, and within minutes, all 6 of Jerry's hired muscle were groaning on the pavement. I planted my foot firmly on Jerry's chest, pinning his one healthy leg down as his remaining I filled with a mixture of rage and terror. I looked down at him and told him this was his very last warning. I made it clear that if he ever came after me again, I would personally send him to hell. Jerry just screamed back, telling me to kill him now or he would never stop coming for me. I looked over at Olivia and thought about how I didn't drink and was always a gentleman with Chloe, who frequently told me I was the kind of reliable man she wanted to marry. I had no interest in that domestic life, though, having only ever told her one thing that was true, which was that I would teach her boyfriend a lesson for her. I promised her that if he ever touched her again, he would pay dearly. Every time she heard me say that, her eyes would well up with tears. From where I stood, she had fallen completely and madly in love with me, constantly finding new ways to please me out of fear that I might grow tired of her. She often told me that meeting me felt like a beautiful dream and that she was so happy it actually scared her to think it might all vanish. I would just lean in and whisper in her ear that perhaps meeting me wasn't a dream at all, but a curse. Following our plan, Chloe lured her boyfriend, Ryan, to the underground arena and convinced him to actually step into the ring with me. Years of heavy drinking had taken a toll on his body, yet he still carried that same arrogant look in his eyes. The moment he recognized me, his face turned deathly pale. He started to ask how the hell I was there, but I didn't give him the chance to finish, knocking him unconscious with a single blow. By the time Ryan woke up, he was bound to a chair in a dilapidated shack back in the Barrens, unable to move a muscle. I pulled Chloe into my arms right in front of him, and she gave me a long, tender kiss. The sight of it made Ryan's eyes burn with a murderous rage. He started screaming at her, calling her a cheating bitch, but Chloe just walked up and slapped him across the face before coming clean about everything. She told him flatly that she had been my woman for a while now and asked what he planned to do about it. Ryan spat a mouthful of blood and looked at her with pure despair, cursing her and telling her she deserved a miserable death. Chloe screamed back at him, asking what she had ever gotten out of all those years they spent together besides constant beatings. I leaned in and whispered that he was the one who deserved to die, then quietly handed her a heavy steel shovel. I asked her if she wanted to cripple him first, since I was worried he might try to come after her for revenge later. Memories of his abuse caused Chloe's expression to turn cold and hard as she took the shovel and began brutally smashing Ryan's arms and legs. Thud after thud echoed through the shack until his limbs were shattered, leaving Ryan howling in the chair. He screamed that she had no heart and called her a monster and a common whore. I grabbed Chloe's trembling hand and whispered in her ear that he was never going to let this go. I suggested that perhaps it would be better if he just disappeared forever. Those words seemed to unlock something dark inside her. A look of pure malice appeared in Chloe's eyes, and after one final, heavy thud, Ryan finally went silent. Chloe collapsed against me, sobbing that she had done it all for us and for our future together. I held her and told her she had done a great job and was incredibly brave. Then I picked up my phone and called the police. I handed over a silent surveillance recording that captured the entire incident in vivid detail, making it impossible for Chloe to ever deny what she had done. On the night before her trial, she insisted on seeing me, threatening to take her own life if I didn't show up. I eventually agreed to the visit. Sitting in the holding cell, she looked at me with total confusion, unable to comprehend why I would betray her like this. I simply asked her if she remembered Clara, the woman from the food truck incident years ago. Chloe's pupils dilated in shock as the realization hit her, and she let out a bitter laugh, admitting she knew I looked familiar. She recalled that night from years ago, which was almost a mirror image of the present, where she, Ryan, and her friend were eating at a late-night food truck when they spotted Clara. Ryan was still bitter about being expelled for bullying me, so he egged on 3 local thugs to go teach her a lesson. Those guys were low-life criminals who didn't give a damn about the law. 2 of them pinned Clara down and pressed her face against the searing hot grill of the food truck while she screamed and struggled, and the third one just kept kicking her in the stomach over and over again. She lost a massive amount of blood, and if a passerby hadn't called for an ambulance, she would have died right there on the sidewalk. The 3 men who actually did the deed were sentenced to prison, but you and Ryan got off scot-free by just paying a small settlement. Chloe looked completely bewildered, arguing that neither she nor Ryan had ever actually touched her that night. I knew exactly what she was trying to say, but I didn't give a damn about technicalities. I told her that if the 2 of them hadn't been cheering and instigating the attack, Clara wouldn't have spent her remaining days in agony before finally dying from her injuries. I made it clear that this was their debt to pay. She looked like she wanted to ask one last question, but I cut her off by telling her that I had never loved her for even a single second. Chloe was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole. She probably thought her life was over, but since she was still young, she held on to the hope that she might one day taste freedom again. I had no intention of letting that happen. Meanwhile, I spent a fortune to secure a spot for Clara on the memorial wall of the most prestigious church in Riverton, refusing to leave her in the dirt because I worried that once I was gone, no one would ever visit her grave again. In a church, there are always people praying, leaving flowers, and lighting candles, which seemed like a much more dignified resting place for orphans like us. However, when I returned to the Barrens with a crew to relocate her remains, I found the wooden cross smashed to pieces and the ground torn up. Clara's urn was nowhere to be found. At that moment, a wave of cold terror washed over me. After reviewing the surveillance footage from a nearby intersection, I saw Jerry's car and realized he had been to the Barrens. It was immediately obvious that this was Megan's doing. Back when I first moved in with the Sterlings, I used to make a trip back to the slums every month just to visit Clara's grave. Megan was the only person in the entire family who knew about those visits. She had even hired someone to dig into my past, so she understood perfectly how much Clara meant to me. I still remember the look of utter contempt on her face when she mocked me, saying that lower-class people were always obsessed with that kind of sentimental garbage and that it only proved what kind of person I really was. When she came to bring me home a few days ago, she had already dropped hints about using Clara's grave as leverage against me. That woman actually had the nerve to use a dead person as a bargaining chip more than once. She had to die. I stormed into the Sterling Group headquarters and burst through the doors of the executive office, demanding to know where she had taken Clara's remains. Megan's assistant scrambled in after me, stuttering about how I had forced my way in and that he was calling security immediately. Megan simply closed the folder she was holding, looking entirely unsurprised to see me, as if she had been expecting this visit all along. She dismissed the assistant with a wave of her hand and calmly gestured for me to take a seat. She told me that if I did what our father wanted and married Olivia, she would reveal the location of the remains. I told her she was disgusting for using the dead as a pawn, but she didn't even blink. She claimed that the dirt grave in that slum was an embarrassment and that she was doing me a favor by moving her to a more dignified location as compensation for how they had treated me. She admitted they might have neglected me in the past, but pointed out that Jerry had already paid a price for his mistakes. She suggested we let the matter go and promised that if I put the family first, she and our father would take good care of me. Her voice was calm and patronizing, clearly expecting me to roll over and become her loyal little lapdog. Megan thought she had the upper hand, but she failed to realize that I was already teetering on the edge of sanity. I slammed my phone down on her desk, displaying a video that was already playing. In the footage, Jerry was standing by a dumpster, opening a small black box and dumping handfuls of white powder into the trash. I told her with a trembling voice that the box in the video was Clara's urn. I stared at her with bloodshot eyes before suddenly lunging across the desk and seizing Megan by the throat. I told her that every single member of the Sterling family deserved to die. Gritting my teeth, I promised her that I would personally see to it that they all went to hell. Megan's lips began to tremble uncontrollably as her face turned as white as a sheet. She gasped out that she had no idea he would do that and claimed she was only trying to help me, insisting she never meant for things to go this far. I let go of her, and she collapsed onto the floor like a discarded rag. Once I walked out, a terrified Megan went home to tell our father what had happened. Robert was livid when he heard the story and immediately summoned Jerry to scream at him for his stupidity. He roared at Jerry, asking how he could be so stupid as to desecrate the dead and what possessed him to do such a thing. Jerry was caught completely off guard by how quickly he had been found out and stood there in stunned silence. Just then, Eleanor walked in and immediately moved to shield Jerry. Once she heard what was going on, she turned her fury on Robert, screaming that I was an animal who had blinded Jerry and never even offered an apology. She argued that Jerry was only trying to get some justice and asked what was so wrong with that. Robert was so infuriated by her blatant favoritism that his face turned a deep shade of crimson. He asked Eleanor if she had lost her mind, reminding her that I was also her biological son. She snapped back that he was the crazy one, asking why he still considered that animal his son when I had already turned my back on them. For over 20 years, Eleanor had poured all the love she felt for her missing child into Jerry until, in her heart, Jerry effectively became the son she had lost. Robert, however, was more interested in lineage, or more accurately, the profit that came with it. The Vance family already looked down on Jerry for being adopted, and now that he was missing an eye, there was absolutely no chance they would let Olivia marry him. Furthermore, Robert wasn't blind and had long since noticed the unusual way Olivia looked at me whenever I was around. At this point, a sliver of regret began to form in Robert Sterling's mind, realizing he had made a grave mistake by underestimating his biological son. I tracked down Pops and told him that I needed his help because I was going to systematically dismantle the Sterling family bit by bit. I told him that I would carry his legacy forward, and that if we played our cards right, the people of Riverton would be paying their respects to his memory for decades to come. Pops practically jumped out of his chair, calling me a jinx and reminding me that at 63, he was still in his prime and didn't need any talk of funerals. Despite his protests, I could tell that my words had touched a chord deep within him. Words like legacy and legend made his eyes sparkle, and he started excitedly shouting about buying a new keyboard so he could write his memoirs. Even so, he still tried to talk some sense into me, advising me not to do something I might regret for the rest of my life. He reminded me that they were still my family and argued that while their actions were terrible, they didn't necessarily deserve to die for them. I told him no, they had to die because my real family had passed away a long time ago. He saw the cold determination in my eyes and eventually just gave a slow, solemn nod of understanding. In addition to Pop's underworld connections, I managed to secure the backing of several major power players in Riverton. The price for their support was simple. I would have to throw a few fights whenever they needed a specific outcome. Whenever they needed a fixed result in the ring, I would be the one to deliver it. After hearing my full plan, one of the wealthy donors remarked that bringing down the Sterlings was actually quite simple and questioned why I was making it so complicated. I told him that I wasn't just interested in bankrupting them. I wanted every single member of that family to end up in hell. The mogul just shrugged and called me a truly sinister kid. I reached out to Robert Sterling myself and told him I was willing to return to the fold and go through with the wedding to Olivia on one condition. Jerry had to go. Robert agreed immediately, promising he would handle Eleanor, and he quickly arranged for Jerry to be hidden away at their remote country estate. From his perspective, as long as the marriage was finalized and the merger went through, the Sterling Empire would only continue to grow. He was convinced that once I got a real taste of the power and wealth our family held, I would fall right into line. He figured that nobody would turn down a life of luxury and a seat in high society. Since we shared the same blood, he was certain that I would eventually come to appreciate his calculated vision. He had no idea that this was actually the beginning of his worst nightmare. When Olivia heard that I had supposedly had a change of heart, the usually untouchable woman actually came to see me in person. She told me it was good that I had come to my senses and even offered a rare explanation, claiming she had only ever seen Jerry as a younger brother and never felt anything more for him. She was desperately trying to justify her past choices, like why she always sided with the adopted son, and even went as far as pushing me into a prison cell for him. The way she was looking at me now actually carried a hint of genuine affection, but it only made my stomach churn with disgust. It is funny how some people only realize what they had once it's gone, and then try to crawl back with a look of feigned pity. Remembering how Olivia had treated me in the past, I knew there was no way I was letting her off the hook. I came up with a random excuse to take her out for dinner. It was a cliché, overly romantic candlelight dinner, and I waited for the right moment to slip something into her wine. After a couple of glasses, she was completely out cold, so I drove her to an abandoned warehouse that was empty except for a large mattress in the middle of the floor. I had hidden a dozen cameras in the four corners of the room, their little red lights blinking as they recorded every second. I tossed Olivia onto the mattress and headed upstairs to a small office on the second floor. 7 or 8 men in black suits were waiting there, along with a long-haired man curled up on the ground who was mumbling incoherently with glazed eyes, clearly high out of his mind. I lifted Jerry's chin with the tip of my shoe and asked him if he remembered me before spitting right in his face. My guys had snatched him from the country estate and pumped him full of hallucinogens on the long drive back until he was completely disconnected from reality. I gave the signal to start, and one of the men in suits clipped a heavy iron chain to the collar around Jerry's neck and led him downstairs like a dog. The moment Jerry saw Olivia lying naked on the mattress, the drugs in his system seemed to explode with predatory energy. He lunged at her like a rabid animal, his hands clamping down on her collarbones as if he were trying to tear her apart. At the same time, the cocktail I had given Olivia began to take effect, and she started to respond to him, even becoming the aggressor. I sat in the upstairs office and watched the entire sordid affair unfold on the monitors for 2 full hours. Over the next few days, both families were busy with intense wedding preparations. Olivia seemed to be in her element, ordering custom gowns and meticulously planning a honeymoon through Europe, throwing herself entirely into every little detail. I played my part perfectly, showing up for engagement photos and tuxedo fittings whenever required. As we spent more time together, she seemed to soften up and even started sharing some of her personal thoughts with me. One day, she admitted that while she knew the marriage started as a business arrangement, I was exactly what she wanted in a husband, and she hoped our relationship would eventually grow into one based on love. She suggested we build a life together, noting that her parents' marriage was also arranged, and yet they were very happy. It was clear she was pinning all her hopes for the future on our life together. When the wedding day finally arrived, the banquet hall was packed to the rafters, and the hotel's valet line was a seemingly endless row of Bentleys waiting to drop off guests. The guest list wasn't just limited to friends of the Sterlings and Fiancée. It felt more like a massive summit of Riverton's most powerful elite. The two families were using the wedding as a display of power to pave the way for their upcoming market expansion. At noon, I escorted Olivia down the red carpet and onto the stage, where we stood side by side listening to the officiant's speech and accepting the congratulations of the crowd. Suddenly, a piercing shout shattered the atmosphere of the hall as Jerry burst through the doors, screaming that Olivia couldn't marry me. Every head in the room turned, immediately recognizing the Sterling family's adopted son, and the entire place went dead silent. Olivia hissed at him, asking if he had lost his mind and demanding that he get out immediately, her face a mixture of deep shame and white-hot rage. As Jerry marched toward the stage, she warned him through gritted teeth that she would never forgive him if he ruined her big day. Jerry just clenched his jaw and told her she would regret marrying me, insisting that he was the only one who truly belonged with her. I let out a mocking chuckle and asked him if a one-eyed cripple really thought he stood chance. Jerry raised his voice to a shout and announced to the entire room that he and Olivia had already slept together as husband and wife. The hall erupted into a frenzy of gasps and frantic whispering. Over at the head table, Robert nearly fell out of his chair, pointing a shaking finger at Jerry and calling him an animal who was trying to destroy the family with his lies. That was the very first time Robert had ever referred to Jerry as an animal. In the crowd, people were whispering about how good the show was and noting that Jerry didn't look like he was lying. Others made crude jokes about the two brothers sharing a wife, commenting on how lucky Olivia was to have one on each arm like some kind of modern-day empress. The vulgar comments spread through the guests like wildfire, and Olivia's face turned a ghostly white before she slapped Jerry hard enough to make his eyes water. Jerry clutched his stinging face, looking hesitant as his words failed him. I stepped forward and patted his shoulder with an expression of feigned disappointment and saintly forgiveness, telling him it was fine and that I would take it from there. The massive screen descended from the ceiling as the guests looked on in confusion, and I proceeded to play the video I had carefully prepared. A few seconds later, the hall was filled with the sound of women screaming, and while some people covered their eyes, nobody could escape the filthy sounds of moaning and grunting blasting from the speakers. Since they couldn't pretend to be shocked anymore, Many guests started peeking through their fingers. Most of the men, however, were staring intently at the screen as if they were trying to learn new tricks. Olivia began to shriek that the video was a deep fake and that it wasn't her, screaming at everyone to turn it off and look away until her voice went hoarse. Every staff member at the venue was on my payroll, and the Vance family bodyguards had already been neutralized, so nobody listened to her orders. She started pulling her hair and eventually collapsed among her bridesmaids in a fit of hysterical sobbing. With a heavy thud, Olivia's father suddenly collapsed, having been shocked into unconsciousness, while her mother rushed to him, screaming for help. The Sterlings sat frozen in their seats, their faces burning with unbearable shame. Robert's face was a dark shade of red as he turned to me and screamed, calling me an animal and asking if I was so desperate for revenge that I was willing to destroy my own reputation too. I told him that if I could drag them all down to hell with me, I didn't care about my reputation or even my own life. Robert Sterling would never understand that from the moment they desecrated Clara's memory, this had become a fight to the death. The wedding scandal served as the final nail in the coffin for both families, as Sterling and Vance were immediately crucified by public opinion. Their business competitors wasted no time in pouncing on them, flooding the media with a tidal wave of damaging scandals and accusations. The news cycles began focusing heavily on the quality of Sterling products, citing various authoritative reports claiming that their best-selling items contained carcinogenic materials. In any other situation, Robert would have hired a team of lawyers to sue his accusers into bankruptcy. This time, however, several of Riverton's most powerful moguls had decided to act in unison to take him down. They managed to cut off every single one of Sterling's supply channels, effectively kicking them out of the market entirely. Various regulatory agencies also started sending inspectors to their facilities, seizing all their inventory for supposed random testing. Robert knew deep down that it was all over, and he took out his fury on Jerry, beating the boy with a belt until he was on his knees begging for mercy. Eleanor couldn't stand the sight and threw herself in front of Jerry, screaming at Robert that killing the boy wouldn't change anything and that it was all my fault for deceiving them about Jerry. At that exact moment, Jerry pulled out a concealed fruit knife and, while Eleanor was still shielding him, lunged around her to strike at Robert. The blade sank deep into Robert's chest, going all the way into the hilt. As Eleanor let out a bone-chilling scream, Robert Sterling collapsed to the floor with his eyes wide in disbelief. That look of pure shock was frozen on his face as he died. Jerry fled into the night after murdering his adoptive father, and Eleanor was rushed to the hospital after collapsing from the extreme trauma. The Sterling Empire was on the verge of a total collapse, and seeing that the time was right, the other moguls swooped in to pick the company's bones clean. Every single employee was fired overnight without warning. Megan Sterling, who had once been a rising star in the business world, was now treated like a leper whom everyone avoided. The real power players in the city had made it clear that anyone who tried to help her would be declaring war on them and would be systematically destroyed. Nobody was willing to take that risk. Megan finally understood that an invisible hand had been meticulously directing her family's downfall from the shadows. She had always assumed that I had only managed to crawl my way up to Pops and gain some minor influence in the underworld. She never suspected that Riverton's true elite were actually backing me and helping me exact my revenge. While she was desperately looking for a way out, I was already preparing the killing blow. Back in that same warehouse, I met Megan again, but she was a completely different person now, with all of her former arrogance replaced by nothing but pure, unadulterated fear. She begged for my forgiveness, calling Jerry a monster and saying he would eventually pay for murdering our father. She told me I was her only brother left and pleaded with me for a chance to make things right. If she had been able to return Clara's remains to me, I might have actually considered stopping there, but it was far too late for that. I pulled out my phone and played one more video for her. In the footage, several men were digging up a fresh grave under the cover of night, pulling out Robert Sterling's urn and casually tossing it into the back of a garbage truck. I told her that it was an eye for an eye and that it was finally the Sterling family's turn to experience that pain. Megan completely fell apart and started screaming at the top of her lungs, reminding me that he was my biological father and asking how I could do such a thing. She swore that I would live to regret my actions, desperately trying to appeal to some lingering sense of family loyalty. Unfortunately for her, she was betting on something that had long since died. With a heavy thud, Megan dropped to her knees and begged me to tell her where that garbage truck had gone. I told her simply that garbage trucks usually go to the landfill. I helped her back up and had my men bring in a small table, remarking that during the time I lived in that house, she and I had never actually shared a private meal together. I suggested we fix that right now, asking if she really intended to refuse such a small request from her dear brother. Megan just stared at me, unable to find any words. I told her she was going to eat whether she was hungry or not, and cut her off when she started to ask about our father's ashes again. A chef brought in a single bowl of fried rice, and I pointed to it. I told her it was her favorite kind and that I had actually flown in a chef from out of state just to prepare it for her. I noted that in any high-end restaurant, a bowl like that would cost $500. The rice was glistening and fragrant, and Megan forced a weak smile, saying I didn't have to go to such lengths. It took her 15 minutes, but she finally choked down every single grain in the bowl. I asked her how it tasted, and she nodded, saying it was the best thing she had ever eaten before asking once again where our father's ashes were. She clearly thought this was just another one of my twisted revenge games where I forced her to have a meal with me. She probably figured I was just losing my mind and seeking some form of perverse validation or family connection. A look of pity actually crossed her face as she told me I didn't have to be like this, promising to be a good sister from now on to make up for the past. I told her that wouldn't be necessary and let a cruel smile spread across my face. I revealed that the secret to the dish's wonderful flavor was a very special ingredient, those ashes she was so worried about. I told her that it was the ashes that gave the rice such a unique, layered flavor profile. Megan's eyes widened in horror, as if her heart were being pierced by 1,000 needles. Once she realized I wasn't joking, she began to vomit uncontrollably, desperately shoving her fingers down her throat to try and force the food back up. She shrieked that I wasn't human and called me a heartless monster, but I just ignored her insults. I pointed out that even tigers don't eat their own, yet she had just consumed her own father. I told her that she was the real animal here. Those final words hit her like a sledgehammer, completely shattering whatever was left of her sanity. From that day forward, Megan Sterling was never seen again. Back at the mansion, it was finally Eleanor's turn to live with regret. Her favorite son had murdered her husband, her daughter had vanished without a trace, and her biological son refused to even acknowledge her existence. She was left all alone, her voice echoing through the massive, empty halls of the estate. She started showing up at the club every other day, kneeling on the floor and begging for me to just look at her and forgive her. I treated her like she was invisible. I was far too busy investigating the details of a recent fatal car accident while simultaneously leaning on the Vance family to make Olivia take the fall for it. With the Sterlings out of the picture, the Vance family didn't dare refuse my demands. That specific accident was one of the worst Riverton had seen in years, leaving 3 dead and 5 injured in a hit and run. Following her arrest, Olivia was actually facing a potential death sentence. Ultimately, the Vance family paid out an astronomical sum to the victims' families to secure their forgiveness, which resulted in her sentence being commuted to 13 years. I visited her once in my official capacity as her husband. Even though the wedding had turned into a global laughingstock, the paperwork was all in order and we were legally married. I casually mentioned that if she happened to die in prison, the entire Vance fortune might end up coming to me. She didn't react at all, simply stating that I was a heartless devil. She told me flatly that she regretted ever meeting me. On that point, we were in total agreement because nobody was going to mess with me and walk away unscathed. As for Jerry, he had become a fugitive living like a cockroach in the shadows, constantly looking over his shoulder every time he stepped outside. That life of constant fear didn't last very long for him. I managed to track him down and had him brought to a remote cabin deep in the woods. He found a familiar face waiting for him. And to ensure that neither of them had any chance of escaping, I systematically broke both of their legs. After breaking their legs to prevent any escape, I completely cut off their supply of food and water. Jerry immediately started begging for mercy, slamming his forehead against the floor over and over. He called me his brother and promised to vanish forever if I just let him go. I just patted his head like he was a stray dog, my voice sounding as cold as gray dirt. I told him that since Claire's ashes were gone, she would never forgive me if I let him live. I advised him to try being a decent human being in his next life. I personally welded the doors and windows shut and sat back to watch their final descent into inhumanity. At first, they just spent their time screaming accusations at one another until they both lost their voices. Eventually, the thirst became unbearable and they were forced to drink their own urine. When the hunger set in, they started catching spiders and cockroaches or anything else that moved and shoving it into their mouths. Finally, they reached the point where they turned their teeth on each other. Fortunately for Jerry, Megan still had some of her looks, so he found her palatable enough to start with. When it was his turn to provide the meal, the flavor was reportedly much less pleasant. On the 17th day, Megan finally stopped. Before his last shred of sanity vanished, a half-mad Jerry committed the ultimate taboo by carving the meat from her bones and drinking her blood. That gruesome meal was enough to keep him alive for another 2 days. Eleanor tracked me down once more, and this time, I showed her the full recording of Megan's final days in the cabin. When she saw that her daughter hadn't even left behind a complete corpse, she collapsed to the ground, wailing and beating her chest in agony. She unleashed a torrent of the most vile curses imaginable upon Jerry, wishing him every kind of suffering. She screamed that he deserved to be struck by lightning and turned to ash, hoping his death was as painful as possible. Yet despite her immense grief, she still couldn't find the courage to end her own life. From beginning to end, she remained a selfish woman who only cared about her own survival. I looked up at the sky and saw the clouds forming what looked like Claire's face, smiling down. I shouted up at the heavens with pure triumph, telling Clara that I had finally done it and that nobody would ever dare to blame me. As for Chloe's perspective in prison, her very first day was a nightmare where she was forced into a humiliating situation that left her with permanent physical injuries. Eventually, she managed to strike up a friendship with another inmate, a woman named Olivia. The name Lucas Sterling became a topic we discussed endlessly every single day. She was his legal wife, and I had been the woman in his life, which in a twisted way made us like sisters. I started spending all my time in the prison library studying law books, eventually discovering that I might actually have a chance at parole in the future. By the time I got out, I would be older, but not too old to exact my revenge on him. I told myself to just wait for me, Lucas. Then one day, Olivia received word that her parents were in danger and that Lucas was coming. She started muttering to herself incessantly that it couldn't happen, looking like she was completely losing her mind. That night, in the pitch-black cell, a sharpened toothbrush was driven deep into my throat. As my life slowly ebbed away, the very last thing I saw was a pair of bloodshot, crazed eyes staring back at me. Olivia had killed me with her own hands. This story reveals a brutal truth. When a person is stripped of all love, hope, and any way out, the malice they unleash will be enough to consume everything.